This is Sony's cheapest interchangeable lens camera, and I decided to use it for a full week of professional work to find out whether anyone would notice. It did not go as I expected it would, so stick around. I'm going to test it out on 4 real photo shoots, and at the end of this video, I'll show you all the final edited images and tell you what I thought of it as a professional camera. So for this challenge, I have 4 photo shoots over the course of a week. 1 food shoot, 2 different product shoots, and a portrait session. But let's talk about lenses quickly, because I'm not just about to throw a $2,000 piece of glass on this $600 camera. That would be too easy. So I paid a visit to YouTube's cheap lens guru, Mark Weimels, and he chose some very affordable glass for me to try. Links to all the gear used in this video can be found in the description, so you don't have to go hunting around for anything. Number 1 is a 27mm f2.8 lens, around $150 US. This is a focal length of around 40mm that I'm very comfortable with. To be honest, the main thing that drew me to this lens was just how cool it looked. Most of the Chinese lenses I've seen have horrible branding all over and just really cheap looking builds, but this thing is subtle and beautiful, and at f2.8 it will give me a lot more light than a kit lens would. Number 2 is a 35mm f1.8 lens, again around $150. I did want something a little bit faster in case I'm in a situation where I need more light or less background. It's about a 50mm equivalent, so again a focal length that I feel pretty comfortable with, and as an added bonus, another very sleek, nice looking lens. Number 3 is the weirdest and cheapest of all the lenses I used, and it comes in at around $140 US. It's a 60mm macro lens, and it's also a manual focus, which to be honest, I usually hate. So when Mark recommended this to me, I did not have high hopes for it. Having said that, I don't want to spoil anything, but I think I might have made some of my favorite images ever with it. I also took the kit lens with me. I expected it might come in handy because it's actually a really nice, versatile focal range to have on an APS-C camera, but I ended up ditching it after the first few shots and never pulling it out again. Shoot number 1, food. I honestly went into this shoot so confidently. I charged in and set up my flash, having never even tested out my new setup. Luckily, the chefs were still doing their prep, and I ended up having a little bit of time to do some test shots. Before you ask, this is an extremely cheap lighting setup. The flash is around $65 US, and the modifier cost me about $25. Links to everything are down below. It's extremely affordable and accessible to everyone, so no excuses here. The kit lens was the first lens that I pulled out. I figured I would play it a bit safe here by going with a native Sony glass and just get a small win on the board before I try and experiment too much. But then I started to have some problems. I just couldn't get a consistent focus. I don't know whether it was me or the camera or the lens, but my test shots were just looking very average. And that's when I started to worry a little bit. Maybe I was getting a little bit too cocky, just taking this setup out into the real world and promising to deliver my usual standard of quality images with it. So I switched to the little 27mm and my results were instantly better. I'm not saying the kit lens is bad, but for some reason, even tracking the face, I just couldn't get consistently sharp images. The other thing I found really difficult was the variable aperture, especially because in this case, I was using some off-camera lighting. Every time I touched the zoom, the aperture would shift, and all of a sudden my settings and my lighting would be completely off. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually stuck completely to the third-party lenses after that. My first reaction was honestly shock. I've avoided these Chinese lenses for the longest time because my past experiences were just not that good, but they've come a long way in the last few years. After getting used to the controls of the camera for the first 20 minutes, I really started to settle in and enjoy it. The 27mm and the 35mm I basically used interchangeably. The 35mm obviously giving me a little bit more compression when I needed it. I ended up stopping them down a little bit as most of the shots required the extra depth of field, but they both performed virtually flawlessly. So that's when I cracked out the macro lens to start to experiment a little bit. I kept accidentally changing the aperture as I was hand holding it, and I was out of focus half of the time from just basically breathing. I actually got some decent shots though after that, and I actually learned a couple of valuable lessons that I could take with me into the next shoot. After a rocky start, the first shoot was a big success. I edited up the shots and sent them through, and they matched my previous shoot flawlessly. I also posted them on Instagram, and nobody mentioned the sharpness or image quality, so far so good. Alright, shoots 2 and 3, they're product shoots. A few weeks ago, the guys at Memo Bottle sent me a bunch of product to photograph, and I've been racking my brain to try and think of a cool concept to use it for in a video. So this seemed the perfect opportunity. I started with the black slim bottle, and I wanted to try something different with the lighting, so I set up my Octabox and I started to play around. It's a bit of a tricky product to shoot as it's all black. After a little bit of tinkering, I found the light that I was looking for, and then I started to play with the bounce to try and get some interesting highlights. This is the perfect situation to test out a macro lens like this. The shot is locked off, so on a tripod you can really fine tune your focus and then set and forget a little bit. The 90mm equivalent focal length means that there's no real distortion in the image, and the macro function means you can get really close and actually fill the frame. I got a burst of inspiration halfway through the shoot and decided to whip up a sci-fi-ish type of background on Midjourney. After some trial and error, I had a perfectly lit and themed environment to complement my product, and then I combined the two in Photoshop, and this is the final result. I was really happy with this, and that night when I went to bed, my brain was overflowing with inspiration. So in the morning, I got to work creating a contrasting version for the white bottle. I would normally say create your environment first and then shoot the product to match, but in this case, I knew exactly the lighting I was going to use, so I actually created the background afterwards to suit it. The macro lens again here was absolutely clutch, especially because the product was quite a bit smaller. This one turned out really well too, and I think they look great together. I'll do a proper reveal at the end of the video. So with the memo bottles done, I also had in my office some really beautiful product from Non. I thought this would be a really good challenge as glass bottles are typically one of the trickiest things to photograph. I forgot to film much of the shoot, but the core setup is similar with the bulk of the lighting coming from behind. It was then just a matter of working out where to put my bounce and how to light the liquid up inside the bottle. I then removed the backgrounds, touched up the bottles a little bit, added some drop shadows, and voila, another shoot in the bag with Sony's cheapest camera. Despite the fact that this product is a lot trickier to photograph, this shoot was a cakewalk with the ZV-E10 because I didn't have a client standing over my shoulder watching every move. I got to work at my own pace and really take the time to experiment and get the lighting right. In fact, I actually got so in the zone that I completely forgot the camera and lens that I was using. One of my fears in doing this challenge was that if I did end up making photos that I really liked, that I would regret not having shot them on my beautiful full frame body and glass. Looking at the images now, I can actually say I have no regrets whatsoever. Hand on heart, these images are indistinguishable by all but the most discerning pixel peeping photographers. Again, I sent the images to the respective companies with no mention of the budget setup, and no one so much as raised an eyelid. Okay, before starting this challenge, I would have said this was the easiest shoot of the bunch. I love this style of portrait shoot. You walk around until you find something you like, and then you work in your poses and looks around it. But this is a cheap camera, and I'm shooting cheap lenses. I honestly didn't know how the autofocus was going to hold up. For the most part, I actually shot this on the wide focus mode and let it choose focus for me. I thought this would give me the best picture of how the camera actually performs in a way that a regular person would normally use it. I did also try a bit of spot focus, and I found the results to be roughly the same, to be honest. For some reason, I couldn't work out an easy way to move the focus point around. It wasn't a simple touch of the screen like my A7 IV, but this could just be a setting in the camera that I couldn't find personally. All in all, it really wasn't a bad experience. It was a bit slow, it was a bit less consistent to how I would normally shoot, but I'd say I still shot about 90% of everything in focus, and in terms of image quality, I really can't fault it. The 27mm was awesome for a wider shot, and the 35mm was great for a mid or a tight. Okay, so how was the experience overall? It was a bit less efficient, and I ended up with maybe 10 to 20% less final images than I normally would. But the images I did get were honestly great. In this environment, I did see a little more of the flaws of the cheaper glass. The bokeh maybe wasn't quite as smooth as I'd like, and there was a little bit of chromatic aberration in there too, but nothing that can't be fixed with a few small clicks in post. But we're talking about looking at our images under a microscope here. And we're judging a $750 setup against a $5,000 plus professional setup. Without exaggeration, my G Master lenses are 10 times the cost of these ones. The chances are, if you own this camera or are thinking about buying this camera, then you don't have the high expectations of having previously used a professional kit before, and that's honestly perfect. Truly, if I hadn't used Sony full frame cameras for so long, I wouldn't be so critical of this setup because there would be no comparison to be made. Thinking back to the cameras that I was shooting 12 years ago when I started taking photos, this thing is phenomenal. So the final verdict. For stills, image quality is outstanding. I really can't fault it. The sensor renders colors beautifully, there's plenty of dynamic range in the images, and there's nothing I can't do with the RAW files that I would be able to do with my other cameras. Honestly, it's totally on par with the Sony a7 III that I used for a couple of years before my current camera. The shooting experience was not as smooth, it was a little bit clunky for me and a bit small in my hand. This would improve, I'm sure, with a cheap battery grip and a little bit more time to get familiar with the custom settings of the camera. Is it good enough for professional work? Before I tell you what I think, here are my final edited images from the week. So while it's not my first choice for a camera, in a pinch, I would absolutely be comfortable using it again in future with paying clients. For the size and price, it's a very compelling product, even for a professional photographer to keep in your bag if all else fails. In fact, for the price of this camera and the standard of images that I've made in my own work over the last week, I don't think it's controversial to say that you could make back the cost of this camera and lens in 1 week of shooting. No, actually, scratch that. You could make back that money in 1 day of shooting, if you know what you're doing, that is. This was so much fun to do. If you own this camera, you've made a great choice.